Well, good afternoon. Thank you for being here today. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Francis Su. Let me begin with his bio. Francis Su is the Benedictson Carwa Professor of Mathematics at Harvey Mudd College and former president of the Mathematical Association of America. He received his Ph.D. from Harvard University. His research is in geometric combinatorics and applications to the social sciences, and he has co-authored numerous papers with undergraduates. He also has a passion for teaching and popularizing mathematics through writing and public engagement. In 2013, he received the Heimo Award, a nationwide teaching prize for college math faculty, and in 2018, he won the Helmholtz Ford Writing Award for the highly acclaimed speech that formed the basis for his book, Mathematics for Human Flourishing. His work has been featured in Quanta Magazine, Wired, and the New York Times. What I'd personally like to add to that, as someone who's known Francis since my time as a graduate student, is that he is a person who both passionately pursues the human desires which coax us toward flourishing, and he's also a person whose life displays the virtues that have been developed by that passionate pursuit. Francis delights in exploration and play, and in the pursuit of beauty, truth, justice, and community, and he's a model in the mathematics community of the virtues of creativity, curiosity, patience, humility, empathy, and generosity. And so I'm so excited for all of you to catch Francis's vision today for how mathematics can be a very human endeavor which helps each one of us to flourish and thrive. In closing, please know there will be a question and answer session at 5 p.m., so we ask that you would save your questions until that time. And now please join me in welcoming Dr. Su.
Thanks a lot. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you for spending the afternoon with me. I'd like to tell you a little bit about mathematics and maybe help you think about mathematics or see mathematics in a different way than you're used to. And I really like this quote by Simone Weil. I'll say more about her in a minute. Every being cries out silently to be read differently. I have a friend who is an inmate in a federal prison. His name is Christopher. He's been in trouble with the law since he was 14. He had an addiction to hard drugs, and his involvement in a series of armed robberies led him to prison at age 21 with no chance of parole and a 32-year sentence. So when you think of who does mathematics, would you think of Christopher? And yet he wrote me this letter after 7 years in prison. I've always had a proclivity for mathematics, but being in a very early stage of youth and also living in some adverse circumstances, I never came to understand the true meaning and benefit of pursuing an education. But over the last 3 years, I have purchased and studied a multitude of books to give me a profound understanding of Algebra 1, Algebra 2, college algebra, geometry, trigonometry, Calculus 1, and Calculus 2. And Christopher was now writing me for help in furthering his mathematics education. So I ask again, when you think of who does mathematics, would you think of Christopher? And yet Chris has been on a journey. He's been exploring mathematics with fresh eyes, beginning to see that it's different from the dry and uninspired form of math that he's been taught before. He's growing in his knowledge and love of the subject. And his insights and experience have helped me, a professional mathematician, to believe even more fully that math has something to offer everyone. You see, every being cries out silently to be read differently. Simone Weil is a well-known French religious mystic and a widely revered philosopher. But she's probably less well-known as the younger sister of André Weil, one of history's most famous number theorists. And for Simone, to read someone means to interpret or make a judgment about them. She's saying every being cries out silently to be judged differently. And I sometimes wonder if Simone were crying out about herself because she too loved and participated in mathematics, but she was always comparing herself to her older brother. She writes this: At 14, I fell into one of those fits of bottomless despair that come from adolescence, and I seriously thought of dying because of the mediocrity of my natural faculties. The exceptional gifts of my brother, who had a youth and childhood comparable to those of Pascal, brought my own inferiority home to me. I didn't mind having no visible successes, but what did grieve me was the idea of being excluded from that transcendent kingdom to which only the truly great have access, and wherein truth abides. And I preferred to die rather than live without that truth. Now, we know that Simone loved mathematics because she used mathematical examples in her philosophical writing. And you'll find her in photos of Bourbaki, a group of French mathematicians that included her brother. This is a picture of Bourbaki. You'll see Simone at left poring over some notes, and her brother Andre is there waving the bell. And I often wonder what her relationship to mathematics would be like if she weren't always in Andre's shadow. You see, every being cries out silently to be read differently. Now, you might look at me, a math professor, and think that my relationship to math has always been solid. Maybe you think I've never struggled with math. And like Christopher, I did gravitate to math as a youth. But I grew up in a small rural town in South Texas with limited opportunities. Yes, that's me, with hair. Most of my high school peers didn't attend college. Now, I did have supportive teachers throughout high school and at university, and I managed to get admitted to Harvard for my Ph.D. But I felt out of place once I got there because I didn't come from an Ivy League school, and unlike my peers, I didn't have a full slate of graduate courses when I entered. And so I felt like Simone, standing next to future Andres, thinking I would never be able to flourish if I were not like them. And I was even told by one professor that I didn't belong in graduate school. And that forced me to consider, among other things, why in the world I was even doing mathematics to begin with. And so that's the question I want all of us to think through. Why do mathematics? Why is Christopher sitting in a prison cell studying calculus that he'll not use as a free man for another 20 years? Why was Simone captivated by transcendent mathematical truths? Why should anybody see herself as a person who does math when others are telling her in subtle and maybe not so subtle ways that she doesn't belong? And our society is also asking what its relationship to mathematics should be. Is mathematics only a tool to make you college and career ready so that you can achieve your real aims in life? Or is math unnecessary for most of us and relevant only for an elite few? And why study math if you'll never use what you're learning? Just think about that for a minute. The mathematics that people are using to innovate today didn't even exist. Much of it didn't even exist 20 years ago. So why is it that you're learning what you're learning at all? Why study math if you'll never use what you're learning? Now, see, these questions arise because math is often just seen as a means to an end, a tool that you'll use later rather than something that serves you well right now. So when people ask, when will I ever use this? What they're really asking is, when will I ever value this? And they equate value with utility because they haven't seen that they can value anything more. And yet in a Florida prison, Christopher isn't asking, when will I ever use this? Right? He's poring over textbooks, learning math in hopeful anticipation of its own intrinsic rewards. So if you asked me, why do mathematics, I would say this: because mathematics helps people flourish. Mathematics is for human flourishing. And so when I say human flourishing, what I'm speaking of is a certain wholeness of being and of doing, of realizing one's potential and helping others to do the same, of acting with honor and treating others with dignity, of living with integrity, even in challenging circumstances. Right? It's not just the same as happiness, and it's not just a state of mind. And one way to think about human flourishing is the well-lived life. What is the well-lived life? And the ancient Greeks had a word for human flourishing, eudaimonia, which you can think of as the overarching good in life, the well-lived life. And there's a similar word in Hebrew, shalom, which is often used as a greeting, and it's translated peace, but it actually has a far richer context. To say shalom to someone is to wish that they would flourish and live well. And Arabic has a related word, salam. And so a basic question taken up by philosophers throughout the ages is, how do you achieve human flourishing? What is the well-lived life? And Aristotle would say flourishing comes through the exercise of virtue. So one way to think about virtue is an excellence of character that leads to an excellence of conduct. So it includes more than just moral virtues. For instance, courage, patience, wisdom, these are all virtues. And so what I hope to convince you of today is that the practice of mathematics cultivates virtues that help people flourish. And these virtues serve you well no matter what profession you choose. And the movement towards virtue happens through basic human desires. And so what I want to talk about today is 7 desires that we all have. And the first of these is exploration. Now, when I was a child, I loved the stars. I grew up in a small town in South Texas in a very rural area, and I lived far from any big city. So I could actually see stars, right? You can't do that here in LA. And maybe people who grow up here don't even know stars exist. And so I begged my parents for a telescope, but we didn't have the money. So I devoured books on astronomy, and I dreamed about space. My childhood imagination was stoked by the journeys of the Voyager probes through the solar system. And I saw pictures like these. These are some of the first pictures that we caught of the rings of Saturn. These were printed in the papers. And I used to marvel at these pictures. I used to imagine myself flying through these rings just like the probes were. You see, exploration is a deep human desire, and it's a mark of human flourishing. And I could explore these worlds even from my living room 900 million miles away. Now, math exploration is very much like space exploration, but of a different kind of space, a space of ideas. You don't know what you'll find when you start. You send out probes to test theories. You're captivated by mystery. You're motivated by questions. You're not deterred by setbacks. And you make discoveries from a distance because the ideas themselves are not physical. You access this space through reason. And exploration is a deep human desire, and it's what it means to do mathematics. And you don't need a lot of resources except your mind to be a math explorer. And as a result, you can embark on an adventure from anywhere, a prison, a small rural town, or a far-flung corner of the earth. And exploration cultivates in us virtues, like imagination and creativity. In order to solve problems, you have to dream up new possibilities. And math lovers like to dream up new ways of visualizing patterns, and they begin to envision the hidden structures underneath them. That's part of what you're doing in mathematics. You're learning to see the unseen. You're learning to see the hidden structures that underlie everything around us. And exploration cultivates in us the expectation of enchantment. You see, explorers are excited by the thrill of finding the unexpected, especially things weird and wonderful, right? It's why hikes through unfamiliar terrain entice us. It's why unexplored caves beckon to us. It's why the strange creatures of the deep sea ocean floor fascinate us, right? What else might be lurking down there? And in math, it's the same way. You know, when we take an object like this, it's called a Menger sponge, with all these self-similar squares and cubes all over, and we slice it diagonally, and we find a bunch of hexagonal stars, we're surprised. We're amazed. Why did that happen? We're enchanted. right? And so we learn to expect enchantment around every corner. If you do mathematics in the right way, you learn to expect enchantment around every corner. It's what makes math exciting to learn, right? So we keep coming back for more. So what would it look like if, as we learn math, we opened ourselves up to enchantment? So if you think of math as just about memorizing things rather than making sense of things, of course you're going to think it's dull and boring. But for Christopher, math isn't just a tool, it's hidden treasure. And so at every opportunity, we need to counter the idea that math is memorization and replace it with the idea that math is exploration. Right? A math memorizer doesn't know how to react in unfamiliar situations, but a math explorer can flexibly adapt to changing conditions. Right? It's part of what you're equipped with if you study mathematics. It's part of what gives you value to your employer if you are somebody who can innovate, somebody who can react to unfamiliar conditions. That's what an explorer does. Somebody who knows how to react in unfamiliar situations. And we can all be math explorers because it is a deep human desire. Here's a second human desire, the desire to play. Think about what it means to play. Various kinds of play, sports play, musical play, beach play, board games, poetic word play. One of the first activities we engage in as babies beyond survival activities is to play. Now, what is play? If you think about it, it's actually a little hard to define, but we can think of a few characteristics that define it. For instance, play is usually fun, otherwise it wouldn't be play. But there's lots of other characteristics as well. There's usually some structure, like the rules of a game or musical chords. But there's a lot of freedom within that structure, right? That freedom leads to exploration of some sort. In jazz, it's called improvisation. In football, it's all the different ways that the game can evolve, depending on the moves that are made. Play is often whimsical, with no great stake in the outcome, right? And the investigation that you do often leads to some kind of surprise, like a discovery or a satisfying pun in wordplay, or a thrilling end to a football game. Now, animals play too, but what we characterize as human play is the enlarged role of the mind and the imagination. So think about the game Set. How many people have played this game Set? It's a very mathematical game in some ways. There's an interplay in any game that you play between structure and freedom. And there's no great stake in the outcome, but there's investigation that can lead to the delight of solving the problem or finding sets of matched cards, right? And so mathematics makes the mind its playground, right? We play with patterns, we play with ideas, we explore what's true, and we enjoy the surprises that arise along the way. There's even a whole area of mathematics known as recreational mathematics. Whole area known as recreational mathematics. Do you know another field that has a recreational discipline? Now, my chemist friend said there is recreational chemistry. You probably shouldn't engage in that. And math play builds in us virtues that enable us to flourish in every area of our lives. For instance, math play builds in us hopefulness and concentration. When you sit with a puzzle long enough, you are actually exercising hope that you'll eventually solve it, right? And exercising hope actually equips you to solve that next problem, even if you don't solve the current one. This is something that we're building by doing mathematics. Math play builds in us the ability to change perspective, right? Just like in gameplay, when you analyze a situation from multiple points of view, yours and your opponent's, and imagine possibilities. You do the same thing in mathematics, right? In much of mathematics, you learn to look at a problem from multiple different views, right? And picking the view that actually helps you solve the problem the quickest way. That's a skill that you are building by doing mathematics. That's the skill that you're transferring, that you're going to be using often more than 20 years from now, more than the actual math content that you're learning. And math play builds in us perseverance, right? Just as weekly soccer practices build up muscles that make us stronger for the next game, weekly math investigations make us more fit for the next problem, even if we don't solve the current problem. And so play is part of human flourishing, and you can't flourish without play. And so if you think about math this way, then you'll think about learning to ask questions, right? Making room for investigation, surprise, imagination. I like to de-emphasize the role of grades in the learning of mathematics as just a measure of progress, not a measure of promise. We should always focus on the process of doing math, not just focus on the outcome of a calculation. We have to make math a playful sport, not a performance sport. Here's a third basic human desire, the desire for beauty. I like this quote by Sofia Kovalevskaya. It is impossible to be a mathematician without being a poet in soul. Who among us does not enjoy beautiful things, right? A beautiful sunset, a sublime sonata, a profound poem, or illuminating idea. And you can experience mathematical beauty even if you don't know much math, right? You might first see it in striking patterns governed by mathematical laws that are as beautiful as a sunset. The turbulence under an airplane wing, fractal patterns in cauliflower, ripples in sand. Actually, that's a picture I took of cauliflower that you don't see this much in the U.S., but I found this cauliflower in England, and I look at it and go, oh my gosh, that's a fractal with self-similar patterns all over. You know, mathematicians study pattern formation. They study all these things, but you don't need to know any mathematics, advanced math, to simply ask the question, why? Why are these patterns here? Where do they come from? And why, in many ways, is the most fundamental mathematical question, right? When you ask that question, you are behaving as a mathematical thinker. And when you begin to study math, you witness a more sublime kind of beauty, right? Like the beauty of a formula that seems to connect surprisingly unrelated things, or the simplicity, regularity, and order of the laws of the universe, right? These are called beautiful. They feel transcendent because they say something about the nature of the universe. And many people have asked this question, why should math be as powerful as it is to explain the world, right? Nobel Prize-winning physicist Eugene Wigner asked this question and said this: the miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics to the formulation of the law of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. Whoa. And Einstein asked this: how can it be that math, after all being a product of human thought independent of experience, is so admirably adapted to the objects of reality? In other words, what he's saying is, why is math as powerful as it is to explain the world? It didn't have to be that way. It could have just been something that was a figment of our imagination. And mathematicians often try to understand why something is true by producing proofs, but we're not just satisfied with any old demonstration of an argument. We actually often look for the most pleasing, or the most, we have a word for this. We say a proof is elegant to describe how a proof is beautiful. Paul Erdős, famous mathematician, often spoke of the book that God keeps, in which all the most elegant proofs of theorems are kept. And pursuing mathematics for its beauty cultivates in us virtues, like the virtue of reflection. When you contemplate beautiful ideas, right, it leads to joyful gratitude and transcendent awe. And when we experience profound beauty from seeing the same beautiful idea everywhere, we begin to build in us another virtue, habits of generalization, because we begin to expect overarching patterns everywhere. So for instance, when I learn a new idea in math, I often ask, what gives this idea its power? What's the underlying principle? How might it apply to a more general situation? And such habits carry over to other areas of my life, right? When I'm cooking a stir fry and I learn a new recipe, I often ask, what general principles does this recipe teach me? Because you know what? I don't want to have to memorize recipes. Just like in math, I don't want to have to memorize formulas, right? I want to understand the general principle, and these general principles teach me things, right? Add garlic and chopped onions first. Put in basil at the end or it's going to lose its color, right? This habit of looking for general cooking principles or general math principles allows you to improvise new delights. If mathematics is for human flourishing, we should try to see its beauty and help others see its beauty. If you want to see or share some joy and beauty, you might enjoy this website I've created with a collection of math fun facts. It's called Math Fun Facts, not surprisingly, which I've often used to whet student interest in math. You see, we have to make reflection a regular part of our math experiences. You might ask yourself what you find beautiful in mathematics and why, or what patterns you see in the world around you. We have to motivate beauty in multiple ways. People come to mathematics in many different ways. It doesn't have to be through just one way. Through art, through music, through expressions in culture, through patterns, through rigorous arguments, through the elegance of simple but profound ideas. And all of you, even if you don't study mathematics, are teachers of mathematics, right? You communicate attitudes about math by what you say and do. If you're going to be a parent someday, you are going to be a teacher of math. Right? Studies show that parents who have math anxiety pass on that anxiety to their kids. So it actually matters how you think about math, and I hope you'll begin to think about mathematics in new ways and see the beauty of mathematics and help others see its beauty. Here's another deep human desire, the desire for justice. Now, my favorite Chinese restaurant serves authentic Chinese food, just like my parents used to make. And when you order an entree, they bring you an appetizer and a dessert as well. And it's a bargain, so I don't complain that the appetizer and the desserts are not themselves authentic Chinese cuisine. The dessert is like this little piece of Jell-O, and the appetizer are these crunchy noodles, which aren't really authentic. But one day I went to this favorite restaurant with a Chinese-speaking friend. I don't speak Chinese personally. I went with this Chinese-speaking friend, and when the appetizer came, it wasn't the crunchies, but it was these delectable pickled cucumbers. Yet my friend had not made any special request. And when the dessert came, it was red bean soup, just like my mom used to make. How come I hadn't gotten this before? I wondered. And I began to see a pattern. When I came to this restaurant with non-Asian friends, I would get the crunchies and the Jell-O. But when I came with Asian friends, I got the good stuff without even asking. And then I noticed that my Chinese friends were offered a completely different menu, a secret menu, with the more authentic dishes. And I looked around the restaurant. I beheld a bizarre sight, people side by side in the same restaurant having very different experiences. Non-Asians ordering from the standard menu and getting Jell-O, but Asians ordering from the secret menu and getting red bean soup. Now, I was told, even when I asked for this menu because I knew about it, no, you won't like the stuff on that menu. You see, even though I'm of Chinese descent, the waiters had assumed because I speak perfect English that I must not be interested in the authentic Chinese food. Now, why do I tell this story? It's because mathematical spaces in the home or in the classroom can be like this restaurant. Whom do we allow a peek at the secret mathematical menu? With whom do we share our mathematical delights? Puzzles, games, toys? Do we share them more with our son than our daughter? Whom do we let into our information circle about math? Whom do we shepherd towards doing more mathematics, and whom do we discourage? What conscious or unconscious assumptions are we making? You see, justice means treating people fairly, and it's required for human flourishing. We flourish, we experience shalom when we treat others justly and when we are treated justly. And Simone Weil realized that correcting injustice must involve changing how we view others. And so if you believe that mathematics exists to help people flourish, you'll realize if you just look around that the demographics of those who do math, or even in the science professions, they don't look like the demographics of America. Right? We've kept somehow whole segments away from the flourishing that's available, either by lack of access or by explicit messages of disapproval. And so to seek justice in mathematics is important. How do we give people an opportunity to flourish in mathematics? And it builds many virtues, among them a concern for the marginalized, a willingness to challenge the status quo. You see, when we begin to see how our experiences are different from our neighbors, we will want the secret menu for everyone. Here's another basic human desire, the desire for freedom. You may not think of freedom as something you associate with math, but there are many freedoms we take for granted. The freedom to imagine, the freedom to explore, the freedom of understanding. These are all freedoms that we experience in mathematics, and they're not there for all of us. I've had a rich correspondence with my friend, Christopher, in prison about freedom, and he's made some astute observations. He said this, at its most basic level, freedom is the ability to act without fear. But as he came to understand from playing chess, freedom is also about knowing all the options available to you. Another player can dominate you and control you by limiting your options on the chessboard. He says this, it's a sign of a skilled chess player that he or she can play well out of any position or circumstance on the board. The person who's unaware of his or her options is like a player who's in a bad position. Because even if there are fruitful paths available to you that you are not aware of, they may as well not exist. This is like if a player finds himself with two bishops against a lone king but doesn't know that two bishops can checkmate, he or she will call a stalemate. But when this person is shown, educated, that two bishops can checkmate, they will always recognize the situation as a win. And this is, in my opinion, the main bridge of education, to take people to a place where they can recognize the pathways to success. By climbing our visions of ourselves, education allows us to transcend ourselves and thereby help others to do the same. This is from Christopher. You see, if you have pursued the freedom that understanding brings, it builds in you resourcefulness. You begin to have hope that problems can indeed be solved. You may take that for granted, but not everybody has that hope. Right? If you grow up in circumstances where most of the problems in your life don't seem like they're being solved by anyone, you begin to lose hope that problems can be solved. And this is one of the great things about education in general and mathematics in particular, is you begin to realize, we can actually solve certain problems, and you're equipped with resourcefulness to do that. Another virtue that you build is fearlessness in asking questions, becoming an independent thinker, and pursuing mathematics is a way to become a freer human being. Here's another basic human desire for community. One of my favorite quotes about teaching is from Parker Palmer, who said, "To teach is to create a space in which the community of truth is practiced." And you can't flourish as a human being without a supportive community, right? A community who open up to each other, share life together, even share math together, share hopes and sorrows, joys and fears. A community helps us normalize struggle and realize I'm not alone in my struggle. And doing math well actually should mean making space for community. The problem is that often in math communities, we're often too focused on achievement. right? A narrow, one-dimensional kind of achievement, right? Hierarchies begin to get reinforced when we rank people according to some singular ability, and this works against community, right? We do this when we think there's only one way to be successful in math, like requiring speed as a measure of math ability. In reality, there's more ways to show growth in math. Too often we think of math as a pole in the ground, and there's only one way for the vine to grow up the pole. And in reality, math is much more like a trellis. And as a vine, you can find your way up the trellis at multiple places where it meets the ground. And you can grow in multiple directions. And so we have to fight this one-dimensional view of math. In the classroom or in the home, we can praise others, not just for showing math skills, but for showing the virtues that are cultivated by mathematics. And remind people that this is part of doing math too. Persistence, curiosity, imagination, habits of generalization, disposition towards beauty. These are all virtues and ways to evidence growth in mathematics. And community helps us see one another's humanity as well. And this is a huge part of doing mathematics as well. And by practicing math in this way, it cultivates in us virtues that are also important in mathematics, like the virtue of hospitality and welcoming new people to math. In vulnerability, when we share our own struggles and normalize that struggling is actually an important part of doing mathematics. We develop a disposition to affirm others, and we build our ability to give attention to people in a deep way. See, this is a part of doing mathematics. Don't let anybody tell you that math is just pure logic, cold and heartless, a bunch of rules to follow. Right? Who would want to learn that? Who would want to teach that? That's not mathematics. So my main claim here is that doing mathematics can't be separated from what it means to be a human being. Because we're not just mathematical machines. We live, we breathe, we feel, we bleed. And if you want to learn math well, you have to see how math connects to the things that you long for, the things that matter, the underlying longings that drive all of us. A desire for exploration, for play, for beauty, for justice, for freedom, for community. Right? So my challenge to each one of us today, you and me, is to believe this, that you and everyone in your life can flourish in mathematics. Right? This is a challenge for me too, because I've fallen short of this ideal. I've written off kids thinking some kids are more fit for math than others, because I didn't have the imagination that I need for the sacred responsibility of teaching. Right? You might have a Christopher in your class, fallen in with drugs, in the wrong crowd, who never seemed interested in math, right? Maybe he even seems lazy. But if you knew what he was going through, you might read him differently. 6 years after he wrote me that first letter from prison, he's now helping other inmates to get their GEDs. He's using his meager income to buy math books, and he's studying topology and advanced analysis now. And he says this, I'm studying anywhere between 3 to 5 hours Monday through Friday and 2+ hours Saturday and Sunday, depending on how I'm feeling. It's harder to study and read here because you're not in a traditional cell with a cell door that you can be enclosed in. But everything is open, and we live in an open-top 8 by 10-foot cube with walls that extend 6 feet off the ground and a 3-foot gap in the 8-foot side to act as your door. Also, I'm in a room without a desk, so I have to take 2 chairs to do studying in. But hopefully that will change soon because I'm in the works of trying to move to a cube with a desk. But I can't complain too much. I grab my earplugs, my 2 chairs, and I go to work. See, I complain about my petty little things, and he's just trying to move to a cube with a desk. Nobody would call him lazy or disinterested now. Would I have had the imagination to envision a math future for him 10 years ago? Believe that you and everyone in your life can flourish in mathematics. You see, what I'm asking you to do is, is at the center of every virtue and anything meaningful in our lives. I'm asking you to love. Love is the greatest human desire, and to love and be loved is the supreme mark of human flourishing. It serves all the other desires for play, for truth, for beauty, for justice, and it's served by them. Every being cries out silently to be read differently. Every being cries out silently to be loved. Christopher in prison wasn't just looking for mathematical advice. He was looking for connection, for someone to reach out to him in his mathematical space and say, I see you, and I believe that you can flourish in mathematics. And when I was in the depths of despair in graduate school, ready to give up, one professor reached out to me. He said, you know, I would rather see you work with me than quit. So I stand before you to ask you, who will you love? Who will you read differently? Simone Weil, after wrestling with her own insecurity in mathematics, saw that there was a path to virtue through her struggle, and she wrote this. The love of our neighbor in all its fullness simply means being able to say to him, what are you going through? It's a recognition that the sufferer exists, not only as a unit in a collection or a specimen from the social category labeled unfortunate, but as a man, exactly like us, who is one day stamped with a special mark by affliction. For this reason, it is enough, but it is indispensable to know how to look at him in a certain way. This way of looking is, first of all, attentive. The soul empties itself of all its own contents in order to receive into itself the being it is looking at, just as he is in all his truth. Only he who is capable of attention can do this. So it comes about that, paradoxical as it may seem, a Latin prose or a geometry problem, even though they are done wrong, may be of great service one day, provided we devote the right kind of effort to them. Should the occasion arise, they can one day make us better able to give someone in affliction exactly the help required to save him at the supreme moment of his need. You see, after spending all those years comparing herself to her brother, she began to understand something deeper about struggle. She saw the path through struggle to virtue, and she understood that mathematics is for human flourishing. And I'll just close with this reflection. It's a letter I received from a fellow named Max, who, after hearing me give a version of this talk, wrote me. And he said this. He said, I just finished reading your wonderful article and felt compelled to reach out with a small personal story. When I was in second grade, I struggled with subtraction, and I asked my teacher for help. She snapped, told me some mean-spirited equivalent of, you need to go figure this out because it isn't hard. And I returned to my desk feeling like the biggest idiot. I barely ever asked for math help after that, and I struggled for mediocre grades until college. In college, I fell in love with an aerospace engineering major. And her deep understanding of mathematics was almost intimidating. And at the same time, I discovered a passion for economics, and through that, math's ability to elegantly explain complex phenomena. I only have an undergrad degree, but I've managed to work in applied math ever since graduating, and today I do time series analysis in healthcare. If only I could tell 8-year-old me of this trajectory. Discovering the beautiful intersection of mathematics and the humanities will always have a very special place in my heart, and I love to share it with others. The path I've been on has shaped my perspective that anyone, regardless of gender, ability, race, or otherwise, can be part of this wonderful thing. You see, math isn't just useful. It's beautiful. Math can be so much more than what we make of it when we see how it's connected to our deepest human desires. And if we see that, we'll see that everyone at your core is really a math person. This means your deepest human desires reveal your mathematical nature, and you just need to awaken it. And to love another human being means to see each person as someone worthy of the beauty and the joy that come from understanding. This is what true love is, envisioning a future, indeed a mathematical future, for everyone that they can't see for themselves. Every being cries out silently to be read differently. Thank you very much.
So you've heard from Dr. Francis Su, and I'd like to introduce the person joining him, who is Dr. Josh Rasmussen. Dr. Rasmussen is a professor of philosophy here at Azusa Pacific University. He received his Ph.D. from the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Rasmussen specializes in questions about existence and minds. He's the author of 5 books, including Defending the Correspondence Theory of Truth, published in 2014, Necessary Existence, published in 2015, and How Reason Can Lead to God, which was published last year. Dr. Rasmussen is also the founder of the Worldview Design YouTube channel, which helps people use reason to address the big questions in life. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Rasmussen. So let's get started. And so here's the first general question, which I'm sure we can answer entirely within 30 seconds or less. What is human flourishing? Right. So Francis, you gave an answer your whole talk, but I maybe just a quick, brief summary, and then Josh, if you would say from your perspective, what is human flourishing? How do we pursue it? How does one achieve, or if it's not possible to achieve, pursue flourishing?
I guess I think of human flourishing as I've described in my talk, as a certain wholeness of being and of doing. And there's the being part and there's the doing part. There's the, and it ties in with this idea of virtue being, a certain aspect of being, excellence of character that leads to excellence of conduct. And so in many ways, I think of flourishing as what happens when you let these virtues play out in your life. And so it's not, as I described, just a state of mind, because it involves doing. And it's not just feeling happy, because you could be in really rotten circumstances and still acting and living with integrity, which I would say is human flourishing in spite of great adversity.
Yeah, so this is just too big of a question for me, but I really like Francis's answer in terms of wholeness. And there's this Greek term sozo, which sometimes is translated as salvation. And I think of my work as a philosopher as involved in seeking wisdom about all the most fundamental things of life. And so I think of wisdom about how to be whole with respect to virtues, which is a kind of inner character. But then there's wholeness with respect to relationships, wholeness with respect to even physical health. And one thing I really loved about the talk that you gave is you talked very practically about how having wisdom in the mathematical realm exercises these virtues that helps you to be more powerful and, in a sense, more whole, more flourishing in actual life. And I think of this in terms of, as a philosopher, that the more wisdom that you actually have, the more powerful you are to navigate the life that you're in. And so I would fundamentally come down to that term sozo, or wholeness, but then leaving it sort of wide open how that can be unpacked. Yeah.
I think another way that I often think about this idea of flourishing is, one way that you flourish is by living up to your full potential, whatever that is, in whatever circumstances you're in.
Can true human flourishing be achieved through other disciplines and not just math? If so, which specific disciplines and what are the virtues they might yield?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and so by giving this talk, I don't mean to imply that math is the only way that you can flourish or build virtues. In fact, in some ways, you can view the talk that I gave as a broad argument for the liberal arts in general. Specifically in mathematics, I've described ways that I see that the practice of mathematics, when done right, leads to the development of virtue. But I think you could say that for almost any academic discipline that you want.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote down on his notepad while he was talking, he said, why is the most fundamental question in mathematics? And I'm like, that's the most fundamental question in philosophy.
Yes.
And, so I mean, I guess we can work together, right, and discover these things.
Yes. Yeah, in fact, it's certainly the case that there should be lots of consonance between math and philosophy, but math and other areas as well, because we're in many ways, a lot of what we do in life is search for truth and for meaning, right? And those kinds of things are expressed differently within a certain discipline. The academic discipline of mathematics, I might search for truth and meaning in a certain mathematical way, and Josh would do it in a certain philosophical way.
Yeah, and it might not even be necessarily a different way. It could
Mm-hmm.
even be, I sort of think of philosophy is digging down to the foundations of all the things, including math. And so then I think of your field as something. I guess maybe as a philosopher, I sort of see everything through the eyes of a philosopher. So you're a philosopher too, because you're swimming in the mathematical abstract realms, seeing relations between ideas. And that to me is part of chasing after wisdom, which is what philosophy is about. And then philosophy also goes down to the foundation of what math is, as well as the foundation of what existence is and what virtue is. And so it's related in that way.
Yes, thank you. I like what you said about philosophy being chasing after wisdom.
Yeah.
It's certainly, if I think about mathematics, I don't necessarily think of mathematics as a certain, as necessarily contributing to a certain way of practical living that maybe chasing after wisdom would imply. But it certainly does equip me with virtues that I think do affect the way that I live and think in non-mathematical areas of my life.
Yeah, well, and I want to actually say I really appreciated that part of your presentation, because you were showing how some of the things that I really love to do in terms of trying to understand some paradoxes, like Russell's paradox of sets of sets that don't have themselves as members. I'm like thinking about that, and then I'm thinking about like how to get out of these puzzles, and I just love it. And then my friends are like, why are you thinking about that? Like, that's unhelpful to anything. But then I'm listening to you and I'm saying, oh, well, I'm actually developing virtues. There's hope that I can have a new solution. There's perseverance. And so, yeah, I mean, if you have a passion for something, you can develop virtue within that area.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. Yeah, you mentioned that as a philosopher, you kind of see everything as philosophy. Philosophy is sort of the foundation of all of it. I just have to say, as someone who studies math, we like to think of everything as built on the foundation of math as well.
Yes, of course. Well, this is like when I met my wife. She was a science Ph.D., and for her, everything was through the realm of science. And so this is, I guess, what we do, right?
That's what
Turf
we do.
wars, right?
Yeah, well, or just, again, changing perspectives.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Which is a mathematical virtue.
Which is a mathematical virtue.
Just kidding.
That's right. That's right. Okay, so maybe broadening from mathematics and heading towards Josh's book, how does reason more broadly contribute to human flourishing?
Yeah, so I have a lot of different conversations with people online and at conferences. And in the beginning of my career, I would think primarily in terms of the language of arguments. And I would think all I have to do is figure out sort of the right argument, the sound argument, get it rationally perfect. And then any mind who discovers that argument will be moved to see new truth. And I've discovered through all these different conversations that there's something I think more fundamental, which is virtue. And in philosophy, and in the construction of arguments, there's a part of virtue which is the intellectual virtues of being humble, willing to be wrong, being curious, being desiring to see more than you had, desiring to see another perspective. And these are the kind of virtues that I think actually can lead you into deep, deep discovery. Whereas I would rather that somebody have those virtues and have wrong beliefs than have right beliefs and not have those virtues. Because there's infinitely many beliefs. There's infinitely many truths. There's always more to see. There's always more of the mathematical landscape that you could see. And what you need to navigate any landscape, whether mathematical or the landscape of virtues or the landscape of morality, is tools to be powerful in your navigation. And in my experience, those tools are first and foremost virtues. And so that's where I see reason as relating to this, is because there are intellectual virtues that actually help you see more truths.
Yeah, it's interesting what the way you've described philosophy and thinking about, if you just have the right argument, maybe people will see exactly the same thing that you do when you present the argument. What's interesting, I'm not sure exactly how to unpack this, but it just occurs to me that in mathematics, we do have certain ways that we reason, and once you accept those ways of reasoning, it should be the case, probably even more so in math than in philosophy or in life, that two people who see the same argument should, I think, probably have an easier time agreeing, because we've somehow agreed on the ways we're going to reason through various arguments, and so that gives math this funny quality of somehow truth is a lot clearer maybe in math once you accept certain assumptions than it is in other fields, and this is a danger as well. Like it's really great that I and someone half the world around me could make the same reasoning and get the same conclusion, and then somehow believe that we're accessing some eternal truth that even though we're separated by oceans and culture and time, right? On the other hand, it causes many people who do math to feel a certain maybe I'm not sure how to describe it, but it's this idea that, oh, well, there's just a right and a wrong answer, and there's no shading in between. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just responding to what the way you're thinking about that.
I wonder if I could ask, this is a little bit of a risky question, but do you think the parallel postulate is true in geometry theory?
I think it depends on the model you choose.
See, this is what I was wondering, because
we should probably fill in people about what the parallel postulate is, but
well, in a way, maybe it doesn't matter exactly what the axioms are, but I like what you said about, given certain assumptions, then we can work ourselves. We can have a kind of alignment, perhaps, about where those assumptions lead. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a saying among the philosophers: for every assumption that one philosopher believes, there's another philosopher who doesn't believe that. And I don't know that it's so much because things have to be less clear in the domain of thinking about the fundamental things, but rather that perhaps anything that somebody can see clearly, somebody else can question. I mean, and even the inference rules. So I could name philosophers who question the inference rules that are assumed in mathematics, right? But it doesn't mean that you can't actually see those inference rules are true. It just means they can be questioned.
Right. Interesting. Yeah.
Okay. Can I change to a somewhat more practical question that, again, I think we'll have no problem solving in the next 2 minutes? So this has gotten a lot of upvotes. Our daily lives are increasingly dictated or influenced by algorithms embedded within apps or technology. We're seeing the fallout of the lack of ethical frameworks for these technologies or algorithms. How can we develop a new approach to promote human flourishing instead of exploitation?
Yeah, this is a huge question for us, and in some ways, I think it highlights what happens when you just think of the stuff you're learning as tools, as a means to an end. And you don't think about how it sits within the larger framework of who we are as human beings, who are more than just instrumental means to an end, right? Like, technology in some ways has made us the product, right? And people are selling our information, selling us as though we're the commodity, without thinking about why these apps exist. Why do businesses exist, right? Do businesses exist, whether they're technological or not, to make money? Or do they exist to promote human flourishing? Right? Those are very different kinds of questions. And if you are, and especially if you're a believer, I think we have to think very differently about the purposes of the things that we engage in.
Just want to add something that plays off of what you said in your lecture about love being a fundamental virtue. And this is something personally that I found helpful for thinking about technology as well as just my own productions and my own work, is why am I doing this? What is the why behind it? And I think if there's any fundamental solution to this question, it would be to come back to this most basic virtue. Ask yourself why. Why use this? What's it for? Is it for serving people, for adding value, for contributing, or is it for using people for the sake of your own progress alone? And then the question turns into, how do you uniquely, with your own unique set of talents and skills and insights, love? So that's how I would tend to think about it.
Yeah, I think we definitely need our education. It's very easy to compartmentalize education. It's easy to compartmentalize learning math as this is the thing I do in this class between this hour and this hour, rather than thinking more holistically about how does this contribute to not just living in the world as a being who knows stuff, but living in the world wisely, as you would say.
Yeah, I would sometimes tell my students that philosophy is the field that discovers the subjects. So one of the unfortunate byproducts of coming out of an education system that sort of divides the subjects and tells you here are the subjects is you sort of think that those are all the subjects, and you think there are these boundaries between them, and so there's all sorts of inquiry into how you demarcate philosophy from science or from math, and you think you have to have these demarcations, and I like how you put it in terms of a more holistic understanding that weeds together technology with ethics, with mathematics, with human flourishing, and you almost have to think holistically to really think effectively about these things. But you would never know about that if you thought that you had to be in the prison of an isolated subject because these were the subjects handed down to you. I mean, I think there are subjects that we have not even discovered yet that would be helpful for us to discover, but we have to actually have an eye to realize that. And then that will give us more power to even deal with some of these big problems.
So the next question I'm going to ask, I'm kind of collapsing two questions here. This question says, if math is essential, good, true, and beautiful, what makes a person hate it? Or what makes a person fall in love with it?
Yeah.
And the other question that a lot of people are asking, which I think goes with it, is where do we start in changing the sometimes negative mindset that students can have towards math?
Yeah, so I as you may have guessed, I do think math is good and true and beautiful. I think just like any good thing, mathematics itself, the practice of doing mathematics can be corrupted. I think if you think a little bit about how we teach mathematics, we don't often teach the exploratory aspect of mathematics, right? We often squelch students' desire to even think because we make people memorize things, right? And of course, yes, it's important to be fluent in learning how to, know your times tables. Yes, I'm not saying you shouldn't know your times tables, but the way I learned math when I learned my times tables was I didn't want to memorize all these things. I started looking for patterns in the times tables, and it just made it a lot easier for me to know those, to know my number facts. And this is a kind of play that I think we don't spend enough time in the educational system allowing students to have that exploration and experience some of the joy. If you think about, forcing kids to do endless worksheets of problems that are completely boring, well, of course you're going to hate math because that's not freedom, right? It's not freedom to say I have to do all these worksheets in order to succeed in math. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't have practice, right? But like when you think about how we teach a sport, we don't teach people to play football by teaching them to do drills and making them do drills for 12 years before they ever play a game, right? We actually let them play the game. And then they see, oh, this is actually an interesting game. And then it motivates people to actually want to do the hard work, working out and getting stronger in order to play the game. So we have to really have a reframing of what it is we're doing in math education. What was the second question?
Where do we start in changing the sometimes negative mindset that students have towards math? Don't give them lots of worksheets would be.
Well, there's some value to it, but I think the inversion, it's a corruption of separating mathematics from what it means to be a human being, right? To be a human being, we should think about, like, this is part of where this whole this whole talk and this whole book came out of, is sort of wrestling with this question: what are the deep human desires that I have, and how does math meet those desires? Because clearly it's doing something for me it's not doing for a lot of the population, right? And why is that? I don't believe fundamentally it's because some people are inherently more capable of experiencing mathematical joy than others. I don't believe that. I believe all of us are capable of having meaningful experiences in mathematics, right? We do that with music. Music is something that everybody appreciates. And we don't say, no, you aren't ever going to be a Beethoven or a Beyonce, so don't even bother learning to do music, or don't even bother trying to appreciate it. No, everybody enjoys music, right? So why is it that math, we don't talk about math that way? Why is it more socially acceptable to complain that, to admit that I was never good at math, right? Why is that something that people laugh at, right? It's because somehow math has become this. I mean, for me, it's a caricature of what math really is. It's all the things, like if I looked at what most people think of math as math, I wouldn't be doing it. It doesn't seem interesting to me.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I don't have anything to add to that, but I have kind of this burning question. And so I don't know if I should wait for that question, but it is kind of related to the true, the beauty, and the good, because I'm wondering what it is about math that in its own structure or in its own nature or in whatever it is that it would have those good qualities, true, beauty, good. And my burning question is, what is it that you think people are discovering when they're discovering mathematical principles? Like, a mathematical principle doesn't seem like it's a particle that you could just affect and change. It seems like there's a more timelessness or a transcendence aspect to it, and that it would have these positive features. And I'm very curious, why you think it has these positive features, and what it is that mathematicians or anybody who's investigating mathematical relations are actually investigating. What is that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that there are certain fundamental ideas that are just beautiful, right? When you see symmetry in not just in an object, like we see a certain symmetry in this object. It looks the same if I cut it right here, the left and the right side. That's symmetry, right? But it's also like more abstractly when you see this kind of thing happening in nature or in a mathematical idea, there's something interesting about that structure that I think is inherently beautiful, and it's hard to describe why.
Are there parts of math that are ugly? Like you're going through the mathematical conjectures and you're like, that's just ugly.
I think some mathematicians would say that when you discover an idea, that some ideas are ugly. They may be true and they may be ugly. And part of what happens often is a mathematician will take an ugly idea and try to make it more beautiful by looking at it, changing perspective, looking at it in the right way. Suddenly, it's illuminating. Or that's the hope, anyways. Yeah. But I think you will find true statements that are ugly. Yes, but they don't appeal.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of another layer to this question. You mentioned ideas, and so you might think that what you're actually investigating is a structure of ideas, which is very interesting in its own right, because if you have different people on different corners of the earth, some people don't even have to be on Earth, like they could be on the moon, and they could be using the light of reason within their own mind to discover the same structure. It's like, well, what is that, right? Like, Sharon and I were talking about this mathematical debate between discovering truths and inventing them. And I'm sort of curious maybe to draw you out a little more on kind of where you fall in that debate. Is this a discovery, or is it just purely an invention, or is it somehow a combination?
Yeah, I would say that mathematics is both created and discovered.
Me too.
That's my own personal view, and it sounds like you agree with that. It is in some ways, since I'm in a school that values faith. In some ways, it's like thinking God's thoughts after God, right? It's you see a truth, and you reason your way to other truths, and in some ways, I'm actually constructing or doing an act of creation in that. But in other ways, if someone at another planet, I have no question that beings at another planet will know the integers. I have no question that they'll know real numbers. They'll come to certain truths that are the same as the truths we have here. Now, you can go a little farther. They won't necessarily know all the same theorems because their reality, their experience may have led them down different mathematical paths, just as our reality would. But
right. I mean, even just distinguishing between the base level axioms versus the implication relations between the principles. And that for me just like blows my mind, like thinking about what is that implication relation between principles that holds across times and places, and while you sleep, the correct answers to the implication relations hold fast, and when you wake up, they're still there. And during your talk, I was just having this picture of people swimming in the mind of God and actually gaining virtues through discovering aspects of the structures of God's own mind. And that I even had this thought, and I'm just going to throw this out here, that there are people who have left a kind of narrow version of religion and found freedom to explore and to play. And they don't even know that they're actually playing in the mind of God. And God is happy with their play, because in their play, they're actually exercising their soul, and they're truly flourishing, perhaps even for the first time. And so it's in a way, I think of that as kind of a beautiful thing, because it shows on this hypothesis that God's mind encompasses the mathematical structures, that God's mind is much bigger than I think people think of it, and more pervasive.
And so how would you answer that question then? Why is it that there are these universal principles?
Yeah,
or
so
truths?
my view has been developing. So kind of in the first stage of my view, it was just a question, and I thought it would be simpler to just to simplify our view of the world, to have fewer entities. And so to have a mathematical entity would be to add complexity beyond necessity. But then in graduate school, as I began to study the philosophy of mathematics and abstract objects more generally, I became convinced that there is a reality here. And so then my view at that point was that, okay, it's all completely discovered. And then my most recent thinking has led me to think that it's not all completely discovered, that actually some of it is created. But that the most fundamental aspects of mathematics, that these are structures that are embedded within God's mind. And that actually the reason that these things have a stability to them is because God's mind has a stability to it. And that God's mind is a perfect maximal mind, which implies perfect maximal qualities, such as perfect rationality and a stable rationality. And that this hypothesis then predicts that there's going to be a stable rational system. And then we find that prediction is actually a successful prediction if indeed mathematicians are discovering this stable rational system. And so, yeah, that would be my general framework on that.
Yeah, your comment about stability reminds me of this idea in mathematics. In my book, I have a chapter called Permanence, which is in several mathematicians have referred to this idea of certain structures being permanent and that being beautiful and attractive. And, for people of faith, that connects very deeply with this idea of an eternal truth or a stable reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In my book, I have a chapter called Foundation of Mathematics. And in there, I have a section on, I don't use the language of permanence. I call it the constancy of math. I need to now add a citation to your book there, because
And IU as well.
it's the same thing, right? And it's striking. I mean,
Yeah.
it is sort of striking. And
Yeah.
and you actually have to use your mind to discover it. It's not just like automatic. You don't discover it just automatically, and you don't discover it just by using your eyeballs. You actually have to use a sort of inner light to see that these principles are unshakable. They don't depend on whether you're thinking about them. And what's true of you is true of every other person.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the things that's really wonderful and attractive that attracted me to mathematics, is just somehow that just by thinking some thoughts, you can come to certain truths that would just otherwise not be accessible.
Yeah,
Right?
I call it the logic telescope. You can see through this logic telescope something about everything. You can see that every single thing obeys the law of non-contradiction. In other words, there's no colorless green aliens anywhere. And you don't even have to visit every planet to know this.
Yeah.
You just sit in your armchair, you close your eyes, and you're like, I see, that's true.
Yes. And mathematicians do that too,
Yeah.
right? Like, I just give you a very concrete example here. So if you think about, we all know how to play cards, or we play, every culture probably plays some version of playing with a deck of cards, right? And a good mathematical question is, how many shuffles does it take to mix a deck of cards? It's a math question. And one of the cool things that I like to do and I can do this. I'm not going to do it here, but I can do this if you ask me later. In just 5 minutes, I could give you an explanation for why it is that when you take a deck of 52 cards and you give it a random, regular riffle shuffle, that shuffling 5 times is not enough to mix the deck. And what's amazing is I could give you that argument. You could see that argument without ever having to pick up a deck of cards and shuffle the deck, right? That's kind of the beauty, the amazing power of mathematics, is that somehow just through pure reason you're able to see things. That's why I love thinking of math as seeing the underlying structures of the world.
Yeah, which may well be the structures within the perfect mind,
Right.
embedded into the world, which maybe implies that God is both transcendent and deeply immanent.
I don't even know
Which
what
is
those
a whole
words mean.
nother.
Maybe.
Well, I mean, sometimes people think of God as like completely outside the universe, and you have to imagine this being completely other.
Oh, yeah.
And then on another school of thought is God is completely just the universe, and as a kind of a pantheism, or that God just is everything. And anyway, so there's a way of maybe bringing those together.
Yeah.
In mathematics.
Yeah.
How does stress affect the pursuit of human flourishing? And what can we do to cope with stress that may occur during this semester through the virtues that we were discussing earlier?
So this isn't my area of expertise. However, it is an area of interest that I have. I've been paying a lot of attention to some of the recent science of happiness. And there's some interesting studies on things you can do, practical things you can do. I don't have a full answer to this question because, like I said, I'm not an expert at all. But one of the things that I've read about is that there is a discipline of paying attention to what's going well, and then writing that down, and doing that every single day. That actually really does help you manage your stress. It feels a little bit artificial because you want to sort of face it. But one of the practices that my wife and I do is we'll review, what went well, as a way of putting into our subconscious mind a positive thought before we sleep. And there's studies showing that people who do this tend to be healthier physically. That's not a complete answer, but it's something that I find personally helpful.
Yeah, I guess I often think about what it is we do that communicates to ourselves that we are more than just the sum of what we contribute, that we're more than just our accomplishments. And one of the ways to remind yourself of that is to do the spiritual practice of taking a Sabbath. It's going to be very hard to resist this idea that we should rest, but sitting within rest and doing only playful things that don't necessarily contribute to your paycheck or your accomplishments, just simply playing on the day that you set aside to play, is rejuvenating, because you are constantly reminding yourself there's more to life than work. And this is one of the, I think it's deeply human idea. It's also a deeply spiritual idea, and it's a really good way to de-stress.
And when you're doing your work, you talked about the sort of intrinsic virtue that you're sort of fulfilled in the very process of the work. And that's the other thing is, to really lean into the happiness that's in your work.
Yes.
And if you're not finding happiness in that work, that's a clue to really think about, okay, where can I be? I mean, I understand, there's tests, there's exams, there's things to do that you just don't want to do. But in the end, that can't be the ultimate pattern.
Yeah. It would be really great if all of us could be in a profession where we deeply enjoy, right? And there are aspects of my job that I don't like. I don't like grading exams. That's drudgery to me. But for the most part, many of the things that I do, helping students learn, helping them flourish, is something that also helps me to flourish. And so I love what you said, that in some ways it isn't necessarily leaning away from work as an answer, but finding work that's meaningful is one way to, and seeing what's meaningful in it beyond its performance value is one way to also de-stress and flourish.
Thank you so much for joining us. Let's thank our presenters again, and have a great evening.